All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a meteorological event that didn't just break a few temperature records, it triggered cascading systemic failures across an entire continent. We are talking about the intensely severe European heat wave of June 2026. And to be clear, this wasn't just a stretch of hot weather. It was a massive systemic shock that literally tested the absolute limits of both human biology and civil engineering. Picture this, 43.3 degrees Celsius. That is over 109 degrees Fahrenheit. And we're not talking about a reading from the deep Sahara here. This staggering temperature was recorded in the Shah department of France in early June. That single massive data point completely shattered any illusion of a mild early summer. It was a profound, undeniable deviation from historical climate norms. Okay, let's map out how we're going to tackle this. We're breaking this explainer down into 5 main pieces. First, the anatomy of a heat dome. Second, the silent human toll. Third, what happens when infrastructure actually melts down. Fourth, the ecological ripple effect. And finally, surviving the new normal. Let's get to it. Part 1, Anatomy of a Heat Dome, or the meteorology of the trap. So, the very first domino to fall in this whole crisis is the weather system itself. It starts with something meteorologists call an omega block. It's this massive, incredibly slow-moving, high-pressure system named because the air currents literally form the shape of the Greek letter omega. And what it does is completely halt normal weather progression. Back in June 2026, it acted like a giant atmospheric wall, forcibly diverting all those normal cooling Atlantic rain fronts way up to the north. But at the exact same time, it trapped a huge African anticyclone directly over Western and Central Europe, just funneling in this exceptionally dry, intensely heated air. To kind of wrap our heads around the sheer physical weight of this thing, listen to how David de Henau from the Royal Meteorological Institute of Belgium describes it. He says, "This phenomenon works like the lid of a saucepan. It traps the heated air and compresses it toward the ground." It's a perfect metaphor, really. It captures that oppressive physical entrapment. It isn't just hot air blowing through, it's heat being actively compressed from above. Let's actually break down the thermodynamics of how this giant saucepan lid works. It's basically a 3-step process. First up is subsidence. Immense columns of air slowly sink toward the Earth's surface, and as they sink into higher pressure, they compress and heat up, a process known as adiabatic heating. Second is solar radiation. Because this high-pressure system stops clouds from forming, you get these cloudless skies that allow maximum intensity solar radiation to just mercilessly bake the surface. And third, trapped heat. The ground tries to re-radiate that heat back up, but the sinking air from step 1 instantly forces it right back down. And since there's practically zero wind to ventilate the area, it creates this brutal, accelerating feedback loop. And here's where it gets genuinely terrifying. Meteorologists call them tropical nights, which means this efficiently brutal feedback loop didn't just switch off when the sun went down. Look at these record overnight minimums in France, nearly 25 degrees Celsius in Cholet. Now, normally, coastal Europe gets relief from cool ocean breezes at night, but strong marine heat waves in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean meant those surrounding waters were already at historically hot levels. They completely eliminated any natural overnight cooling, so the starting baseline temperature for the very next morning was dangerously high before the sun even rose. Moving to part 2, the silent human toll and the physiological breaking point. You know, extreme heat is often called a silent killer, mostly because the physiological breakdown it triggers is practically invisible. Take a look at this staggering number, 101 heat-related deaths. And the wildest part? That didn't even happen during the peak of June. That was recorded in Spain during a precursor heat wave in May. It highlights a fatal flaw in the system: the population's complete lack of physiological acclimatization. Because this heat hits so early in the season, human cardiovascular systems simply didn't have the weeks usually required to adapt to those temperatures. The body's primary cooling mechanisms failed, and mortality risks just skyrocketed with every single incremental degree. But beyond heat stroke, there was this entirely unexpected secondary threat. A really tragic irony, actually. Desperate people, completely unacclimated to the heat, were jumping into unregulated rivers and lakes to cool off, and accidental drownings spiked. Authorities reported 20 drownings in France and at least 5 in Germany over just a single weekend. The culprit? Cold water shock. The sudden immersion in cold water triggers an involuntary gasp reflex, which leads to instant water inhalation and cardiac arrest. All right, part 3, when infrastructure melts down and we hit the engineering limits. Now, what's really interesting about this is how the built environment completely crumbled. When a 40 degrees Celsius threshold hit the UK, again, that's about 104 degrees Fahrenheit, it pushed civil engineering way past its limits. The infrastructure tolerances across Northern Europe were just simply never designed to withstand this kind of thermal stress. They were engineered to survive damp, freezing winters, not Saharan heat domes. The kinetic impacts here are just wild. They rapidly paralyzed transportation. Steel train rails absorbed the sun until they were 20 degrees hotter than the ambient air, expanding and buckling into what the rail industry calls sun kinks, which are huge risks for high-speed derailments. Overhead electrical catenary wires lost their tension and sagged dangerously low. And in Florence, Italy, the braking mechanics on a T1 tram line spontaneously combusted. The heat literally ignited urban transit, forcing an emergency evacuation and shutting down that entire line's power grid. And all of this sets up a classic energy paradox. On one hand, you've got record-spiking demand, millions of people cranking up their air conditioning at the exact same moment. But on the other hand, the power supply is actively collapsing. Why? Well, in France, nuclear power plants like the Golfech reactor rely heavily on river water for cooling. But strict environmental laws prevent those plants from discharging water back into the rivers if it raises the water temperature too much. Because the heat wave had already pushed the Garonne River past its 28 degrees Celsius limit, the reactor legally had to shut down. They lost massive baseload power generation precisely when the grid needed it the absolute most. So the sheer thermal reality of these infrastructure failures completely disrupted civic life. A heat dome doesn't just melt steel, you see, it halts society entirely. Over 3,100 schools in France were shut down or heavily disrupted right in the middle of high school final exams. Schools in the UK mandated emergency early closures, sending kids home well before the afternoon heat peaked. And in Spain, Madrid had to officially cancel outdoor public screenings for the World Cup, recognizing that putting large crowds under sustained sun exposure would practically be a mass casualty event. On to part 4, the ecological ripple effect, or environmental trauma. This intense drying out, this massive desiccation, it didn't just affect human cities. It deeply traumatized the whole continental ecosystem. The relentless heat and dry air rapidly stripped the landscape of moisture, essentially turning Europe into a highly combustible tinderbox. Wildfires broke out with terrifying speed, directly paralyzing Spain's critical high-speed rail corridor between Madrid and Barcelona. But maybe even more shocking is the geographical reach of this. Copernicus satellite imagery actually captured a substantial wildfire burning as far north as Sissinute, Greenland. Greenland, a place known for ice and rocky terrain, definitely not massive wildfires. And the urban environments themselves created these horrifying microclimates for local wildlife. Data from Belgium showed that while the ambient air temperature was hovering around 40 degrees, dark asphalt roofs were absorbing solar radiation and hitting surface temperatures between 50 and 60 degrees Celsius. That is up to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. It created literal oven-like conditions. Meteorologists and animal welfare groups documented these devastating scenes where nesting birds were prematurely jumping out of their roof cavities just to avoid being cooked alive. Finally, part 5, surviving the new normal and the structural deficit. So the crucial point here is that we have to look past the immediate devastation and understand Europe's fundamental, forward-looking maladaptation. As one expert put it, millions of northern European homes effectively transformed into uninhabitable heat traps because these buildings were engineered with heavy insulation and double glazing specifically to survive freezing winters. They simply cannot expel extreme summer heat. And this architectural crisis displaced the thermal emergency directly onto the healthcare system. Vulnerable people couldn't find refuge at home, so they flooded into overwhelmed, often unair-conditioned hospitals that were unfortunately suffering from the exact same structural design flaws. And the data clearly shows this isn't just some one-off freak anomaly. According to a study published in Nature Climate Change, the global population exposed to extreme heat stress, meaning places where the temperature feels like 46 degrees Celsius or more, has surged from 16% in the 1970s to 22% present day. This represents a massive global baseline shift. That 6% jump, that effectively means 1 billion more people have been added to the high-risk pool for extreme heat. Which leaves us with this monumental challenge. As climate change permanently shifts the baseline, how will Europe aggressively retrofit its entire built environment to survive the summers of tomorrow? We are talking about staggering, astronomical capital investments required to re-engineer rail networks, power grids, and millions upon millions of homes for a climate that is simply no longer what it used to be. It's a question of survival that demands an answer today. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.